Chris, what are interacting minds?
Well, interacting minds, the whole concept of interacting minds grew out of social cognition, which is something that didn't really begin until roughly the year 2000. And it started off essentially meaning studying social aspects of life in terms of well-established cognitive processes like working memory and attention. But it rapidly became clear, at least to some of us, that the most interesting aspect of social cognition is when people interact with each other, particularly face-to-face or network to network. And this involved developing new kinds of paradigm for studying. So we had to get away from traditional experimental psychology where you put a subject in a room and tell them to do things all by themselves. So we had to shut two subjects in a room, tell them to do things together. It involved developing new computational models of how interactions work and how you deal with this terrible problem that when I'm trying to outguess you, you're trying to outguess me, at least in competitive situations, which is different from how we interact with the objects in the physical world. And this led naturally to studying things like group decision-making. And when Uta and I retired from UCL, this is the sort of thing we wanted to study. And coming to Aarhus gave us this marvelous opportunity to set this in motion, as it were, and actually to be part of a group that was making group decisions. So in a sense, what we were studying is also what we were doing.
So why is it important to study interacting minds?
Oh, because I think in real life, most of our, 99% of our time is spent with others, and in particular, decisions are normally made jointly, not individually. And this is true both at in the family, but also in society as a whole. I mean, things like elections are massive joint decisions. And what is fascinating is that in some circumstances, well, in principle, group decisions should be better than individual decisions because there's more information available, there are different ideas being brought to play, so you can explore the decision space, if you like to think in those terms, more widely. But in real life, group decisions often go wrong. So it's extremely important to discover what are the circumstances where group decisions are good and what are the circumstances where they're bad, and how can we avoid these bad situations.
What does it take to study interacting minds?
Well, first of all, you need a lot of minds that are interacting. And secondly, I think it critically depends on collaborations, not just because you want people working on it together, but you want people from many different disciplines. There's tendency, for example, when I began in psychology, I was told there was hardly any interaction between the experimental psychologists and the clinical psychologists, and the idea of talking to physiologists was anathema. And gradually, as things over the years, things changed, and certainly within the sciences, it became common practice to collaborate. And this was perhaps the greatest benefit of going into brain imaging, which happened in the late 80s, is this depended upon collaborations between psychologists, radiologists, anatomists, statisticians, and physicists, and neurologists, all working together and having to talk to each other. And this became common practice, but it's only relatively recently that we've also started to branch out so that there are collaborations between science and humanities. So you are a very good example of that because you managed to be an anthropologist and a brain imager at the same time. I've now become a philosopher as well as a neuroimager, and our friend Mattia Gallotti, who's a philosopher, has now started studying the we mode in literature, for example. So there are all sorts of exciting developments in this cross-disciplinary interactions, and we like to think that the humanities have lots to offer at this level, because we're beginning to talk about the person in culture. Because interacting minds is essentially the basis of cumulative culture.
What are the biggest challenges that you are facing when studying interacting minds?
Well, I guess they're still the same, and you could say they're not really different from other areas of study, but I guess from my point of view, and I'm still an experimental psychologist at heart, the challenges are to come up with paradigms, that is to say lab-based experiments, where you can study interacting minds in such a way that it does have some contact with real life. And the other, and I suppose the second, let's say there are three things. So that's one, is to find the paradigm for studying interactions in a controlled manner. Secondly, at this level, it's very important to ask people what their actual experiences are. So we're not just studying behavior and reaction times and things like that. We're actually trying to just study what is it like to be part of an interaction, what sort of conscious ideas, strategies, prior expectations you have. And it's of course a whole area of development of how we can actually get people to introspect reliably and consistently on these matters. And third, and perhaps most difficult, is to come up with computational mechanistic models of the underlying processes. So I mentioned before, in a competitive interaction, for example, I'm trying to guess what you're going to do next, and you're trying to guess what I'm trying to guess you're going to do next, and so on to an infinite recursion, which obviously we can manage without the infinite recursion, and there are people who are beginning to develop clever ways of modeling this. And in the cooperative situation, again, we have to come up with computational models of precisely what's going on. And I think it's only after we have these models and these ways of studying introspection and these paradigms in the lab that we can actually go back to what, in a way, we started off from, which is looking at what's happening in the brain. But for the moment, I think we don't have enough detail to do a lot of brain imaging. But eventually we want to look at the neural basis of all this as well. And that, of course, brings back our collaboration with the neurologists and the anatomists.
So you follow the development at Aarhus University now for more than a decade.
Yeah.
Can you say something about, what are the trends? What has happened to Danish universities or to the university environment here in the meantime?
Well, no, I think that I can't say much about Danish universities in general, but certainly in Aarhus, it's been striking the extent to which collaborations across disciplines have increased. And this is particularly true in the Interacting Minds Centre, where starting off from collaborations between brain imagers and cognitive psychologists and cognitive anthropologists, if one may use that term, it's expanded and brought in linguistics and semiotics, and also, of course, economics and political science, which is particularly relevant to this idea of studying how group decisions work. And this, I think, is extremely powerful for solving many of the problems that I was outlining earlier. So the economists have the models, the political scientists, to some extent, have the paradigms that relate to real life.
Where would you see the largest challenges or tasks or problems to be solved in the near future? What are the most important novel questions to look at?
I still think that the most important novel question is, how do group decisions work, and how can we stop them going wrong?